Final Fantasy. Oh boy, there sure are a lot of those. A name synonymous with console role-playing games, Final Fantasy has been around since the beginning. Starting out on the Famicom in 1987, this, for the most part, Sword and Sorcery RPG series has seen its fair share of highs and lows over the past 30 years. From the dizzying heights of Square's golden age on the SNES and PlayStation, to the stomach-churning lows of Steam ports and the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, this series has truly made its mark on video games. And with Final Fantasy XIV's huge popularity and the incoming Final Fantasy XVI, it doesn't look like this series is going anywhere anytime soon. So, I wanted to look back at this series. My first game in this series was Final Fantasy for the NES, and I have mostly been an ardent fan since then. Now, there are just a few rules to appear on this list. Basically, the game has to have Final Fantasy in the title, and it must be an actual Final Fantasy game. So the Final Fantasy Legend titles and Final Fantasy Adventure won't count, as they're actually Saga and Mana titles respectively. Also, no Chocobo series games, because Final Fantasy is in the title. Sorry, Chocobo's Mysterious Dungeon. So that being said, let's dust off the sword and shield, saddle up the Chocobo, and go kick the shit out of some imps. Honorable mention, Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV started off by putting its worst foot forward, but has now managed to not only climb out of the shit pile, but actually climb to the top of the MMO pile with the likes of WoW. I played the game for an hour or two back in the day, but only really got into it just recently. I haven't managed to play a lot of Final Fantasy XIV, but I wanted to mention it because it is currently scratching an itch I never knew I had. Dishonorable mention, Final Fantasy XIII. All of them. Listen, these games have been beaten to gory paste, and I won't labor too long on them. Despite all the negative publicity when the first Final Fantasy XIII came out, I still got it and gave it a few hours. Then a few dozen hours, and then 40 hours. And I was still walking in straight lines from A to B, B to C, C to D, all the while doing tutorials. I was literally 40 hours into the game and still getting tutorials. The characters and story both seemed decent enough, but having it all buried under monotonous busywork really killed all three of these titles dead to me. Number 10, Final Fantasy. Oh yes, we're starting the list by going back to the very beginning. The title that started it all, Final Fantasy, was an incredible romp through a huge, dangerous world. Not many console RPGs existed in this era, but Final Fantasy, along with Dragon Quest and Phantasy Star, were all there from day one. While today the game is a little obtuse and overly difficult, all the Final Fantasy hallmarks are there. Building your party by choosing 4 different classes, upgrading swords and spells whenever you find a new town, and fighting huge groups of enemies, sometimes being a little too difficult for you. Regardless of its edges being a little bit rough, Final Fantasy is still a fun little game to go back to for a huge nostalgia rush. Number 9, Final Fantasy VII. Also known as the RPG to forever change RPGs, Final Fantasy VII brought worldwide attention to the RPG genre upon its release. Boasting a huge story, massive world, and incredible graphics thanks to the new PlayStation hardware, Final Fantasy VII truly deserves its place in history as one of the most important games ever made. Today, the graphics are poor, the localization is terrible, and the summons take way too long, but the game remains an absolute legend. As a longtime RPG fan, I loved it. It was the reason I got a PlayStation after being a Sega kid for my entire childhood. The fact that this game got so many non-RPG game players into the genre is testimony to Final Fantasy VII's lasting legacy. This game also has incredible off-the-charts meme potential. Number 8, Final Fantasy VIII. See what I did there? Hot on the heels of the blazing hot Final Fantasy VII, the world was eager to see what the sequel was going to be like. The response was totally mixed. Starting with Final Fantasy VI, the sword and sorcery aspects of the previous games started to make way for more technological worlds. By the time we got to Final Fantasy VIII, the transformation to a sleek, semi-future tech had reached completion. As a series that started with that classic Dungeons & Dragons influence, to see such a drastic change turned off a lot of people. But hey, like I said, it took 3 titles to reach this state. The writing was on the wall. Additionally, the magic draw and GF systems were also divisive, leaving many players, just like in real life, unable to find a GF. Number 7. Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy's jump to the PS2 was glorious. The series always did its best to portray emotion through in-game models, but there is only so much that you can do with dialogue and sprites. Final Fantasy X made the transition to big boy graphics and voice acting, and with this change, Final Fantasy would never be the same. On top of this, we ended up getting one of the best versions of the battle system, a huge emotional soundtrack, and lots to do. Even though some of that lots to do is dodging a million lightning bolts, so I guess it's not perfect. Much like how Final Fantasy VII was my reason to get a PS1, Final Fantasy X was the game that really solidified having a PS2 in my mind. Final Fantasy VII was one of the PS1 games, Final Fantasy X was one of the PS2 games. Number 6. Final Fantasy XII. Another divisive title, Final Fantasy XII followed on the heels of Final Fantasy XI Online, and it borrowed a lot from that entry. The gameplay, including battles and quests, were very similar to Final Fantasy XI. If a pseudo-offline kinda MMO doesn't tickle your interest bone, then maybe the heavy and intriguing political plot about warring kingdoms does. Final Fantasy XII also takes place in the recurring locale of Ivalice, the same setting as Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and many others. The combination of storytelling, gameplay, and Fran made Final Fantasy XII a surefire entry on this list. Number 5. Final Fantasy: The Four Heroes of Light. Final Fantasy has inspired a load of other titles, and Final Fantasy: The Four Heroes of Light is one of those. What do I mean? Four Heroes of Light is a unique title in the series with a style all its own that would go on to evolve into the Bravely Default series of games. Four Heroes had its own identity that was so solidly unique that it spun itself out into a brand new series of games. The Four Heroes hat system would go on to become Bravely Default's class system, and its boost system would go on to become Bravely Default's Brave system. Four Heroes of Light is a great game on its own, but the fact it went on to spawn the Bravely Default series as well makes it a must-play for any RPG fan. Number 4. Final Fantasy IV. See, I did it again, but this time it was on accident because jokes are hard. Final Fantasy IV, possibly known to some of you as Final Fantasy II, is the FF title where the story and characters really started becoming their own thing. Each character had their own class and skills, leading to a refined style of gameplay that allowed story and characters to really carry the game. The game was also the first in the series to appear on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Number 3. Final Fantasy V. Jobs. Final Fantasy V is not that different from the previously released Final Fantasy IV. A little nicer to look at, some tweaked systems, tighter combat, but most importantly, the job system. Coming from an SRPG background, I was used to class changes, so Final Fantasy V was just what I was looking for. On top of the class change system, the game also has one of my favorite Uematsu soundtracks, with music covering emotions such as joy, sadness, anger, depression, and more. Final Fantasy V is definitely one of my favorite games in the series. Number 2. Final Fantasy Tactics. Surprise! My second favorite Final Fantasy game isn't even a mainline title, and double surprise, it's a tactics game. And what a tactics game! Final Fantasy Tactics is one of the absolute best tactics games ever made. The game has an incredible and gripping story, but the PS1 translation is a mess, so you won't actually understand a word. The PSP re-release fixes this, but also stretches out the visuals to widescreen and spells really slow down the game considerably. That being said, the gameplay is incredible. The job system is probably the best ever made, allowing you to customize your characters in absolutely ridiculous ways. This also ups the replay value considerably. If you want a good tactics game, Final Fantasy Tactics is definitely the way to go, even if you're not a Final Fantasy fan. Number 1. Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI obliterated my 12-year-old mind. The game ended up being one of my favorite RPGs ever. The graphics were great and the character sprites were very emotive. Now, this was before spoken dialogue and during the era of, oh no, some of these game translations are absolute garbage, but the amount of emotion these little sprites display is incredible. The game's soundtrack is also a thing to behold, potentially Nobuo Uematsu's best OST. Final Fantasy VI's soundtrack is front to back, top to bottom, non-stop bangers. Each character also has very unique skills and uses, so there's lots of replay value because every combination of party members is going to be pretty interesting. Final Fantasy VI just... I've 100%ed the game several times and will probably do it several times more before I die. Just an almost perfect example of what an old school turn-based RPG should be. Man, for being called Final Fantasy, there sure are a lot of them. But that's the list. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your favorites, so leave a comment telling me your favorite game below. Also, if you enjoyed this humble video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can even make a donation if you so desire. I've been Richard for RPG Fortress. See you later.